Okay, Chris Speaks back here today with Brandon Mosley for our BCS State of Alabama podcast with us. We got District 38 candidate Micah Messer. He previously ran in 2022. His extensive background in law enforcement and National Guard. You know, Brandon, 4 years ago almost, when I was just a wannabe political hack, Micah was the first person to let me interview him. Now, 4 years later, when I'm still just a wannabe political hack, I'm glad to have him back here. How are you, Micah?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm pretty good, man. So, let me ask you this. I remember back during, I think it was October or something when they had the hurricanes up in North Carolina. You went up there and
hmm
you was flying the helicopter. Was that part of the National Guard or was you doing some other kind of humanitarian mission?
Yeah, so it wasn't a helicopter. It was I at the time I owned a fixed wing Cherokee 140, which is like a four-seater aircraft.
Oh,
Just an
wow.
airplane. Yeah. And that was not part of the National Guard. That was part of I jumped on board with Operation Airdrop. And what Operation Airdrop does is during, natural disasters, primarily when you can't get aid into areas because of roads being knocked out, bridges being knocked out, we fly aid into those areas. It started years ago, actually in Texas, when I can't remember, the hurricane went through Texas and caused massive flooding that caused a certain area of Texas to be basically cut off. And so some folks created it and they just started flying their own aircraft down there, delivering everything from water to food to diapers or whatever. So yeah, that's what it was. And that's what I did. Yeah, right after Hurricane Helene, I think I was there 3 days after it hit. Maybe it was 4 days after it hit. And I was there for 3 days, flying missions up into the mountains there, several different airports.
Um, so you're replacing Debbie Wood, you hope.
Yes. Yeah,
uh,
I hope. Yes. If the people will have me.
Debbie was pretty good about, trying to champion a post-election audit. Believe it or not, Alabama is the only state
Yes.
that has no form of post-election
Which
audit.
baffles me.
I mean, I thought her bill was a little bit, after she compromised and dealt, was a little bit weaker than I would have liked, but
Mm-hmm.
it still didn't pass. If you become the representative, would you support a post-election audit of some sort of the Alabama election so we can sort of keep tabs on how accurate we are or not?
Yes, absolutely. I will. In fact, I'd be more than happy to sponsor it. One of my primary reasons running is to facilitate some type of statutory auditing system. And like you said, Alabama is the only state in the nation that does not have a statutory post-election audit already on the books, which to me baffles me that we don't have that. California has it, New York has it, Delaware has it, Florida has it, Georgia, Tennessee, every other state has it, but Alabama doesn't. And I was very happy to see Debbie Wood, champion that bill. And I agree. I think it would have been better if it was stronger. But the fact that it had to be weakened anyway, just to get a bill passed the House, and then it failed in the Senate. So it really does baffle me why there seems to be this pushback against it by certain entities in Alabama. To me, it just is common sense. I mean, people need to know that the elections count. Whether you think 2020 was stolen or not, people need to know that when they vote, their vote matters and their vote counts. And having some type of statutory election audit system in place, gives people that sense of security, because it would audit certain, precincts or whatever, randomized and so forth, to go, okay, these precincts are doing it correctly, and then this next precincts and next precincts and so forth. So I 100% I'd be behind that bill. I'm happy to sponsor or co-sponsor it or just vote for it.
We can't hear you, Christopher. Still nothing. Um, well, Micah, the legislature passed constitutional carry, I think about 4 years ago, And, we're still getting a lot of complaints from law enforcement. Some of the sheriffs, they need revenue or some issue they're having, and they keep bringing it up. If you're elected, will you support keeping constitutional carry in place, or do we need some sort of reforms or weakening of it?
No, I'm 100% behind constitutional carry. I was when I ran the first time, and I still am. Big Second Amendment advocate. I understand, having been law enforcement, right? I understand the need for resources, for that financial assistance to make sure that your deputies and your police officers and whoever have the required training primarily, and then tools for the job. However, that doesn't need to come at the expense of someone's rights. And so my advice to these sheriffs and to these city councils and so forth, if your department is struggling with finances, one, reach out to your representative right now and see if you can't get funding for it from the state. Every year we have a budget surplus. There's no reason why law enforcement shouldn't be getting something, grants or whatever, to facilitate the training and tools necessary. Two, if you absolutely need the funding, then your local, state, or it's not state, your local city or your county needs to come up with that funding. That's the job of that representative body, whether it's the county commission or the city council. It's their responsibility. And so if they need to make cuts in other areas to make sure that their law enforcement's getting the funding, then they need to do that. This idea that we need to somehow create a fee system for someone's constitutional rights to facilitate law and order, I mean, we did it for a long time without it. So there's no reason why we can't do it without it now. I mean, we don't put a fee on someone's rights to go and protest. We don't put a fee on someone's rights to, speak up in a public forum or anything like that. So why would we do that for the Second Amendment when we won't do it for the First?
Christopher, have you got your sound situation fixed?
Nope.
Okay, moving on. In this past session, the legislature, the House actually passed legislation requiring the 10 Commandments, as well as other historical documents like the Magna Carta, I guess the Code of Hammurabi, maybe the Constitution, posted in every public school, somewhere in every public school in the state. Now, that didn't get out of the Senate. What's your view on that?
So it's kind of I'm not going to say it's a red herring because it's not the right term. First off, I know for a fact that people in public schools are not being taught, at least it's not, I'm going to say every public school, right? I don't want to blanket every single public school out there, but most public schools in the state of Alabama and in the whole country are not the kids there are not being taught the Constitution, and they're not being taught the Declaration of Independence. They're not being taught the Bible for sure. And that's even if you don't teach a religious text, right? The Bible or whatever, which obviously as a Christian, I'm all for, but even just the basics of Constitution and Declaration of Independence, posting it somewhere is not teaching them. So I'm not against, making sure that it's posted somewhere. Sure. But I don't think that solves the problem. The problem we have is the curriculum in the state of Alabama, the Alabama Career Ready Standards, as they call it, which is basically Common Core. How it's established and who writes those books and what that curriculum is really the fundamental issue of why people, today, people my age today, don't even know, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. They don't know their own rights. And so I think that's more of the heart of the issue. So I'm not opposed to, making sure that it's posted somewhere. Sure. But I don't think that solves the problem.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes. We can hear you now, Christopher.
Okay. I don't know what happened. Okay. So tell me, Michael, what do you think would be your first piece of legislation that you want to introduce?
The audit bill.
The what now? Oh, the audit bill.
The
Okay.
audit bill. Yeah, I think that's, again, why are we the last state again? It's just, it baffles me. People need to know that when they go and vote, it matters. And so we need to make sure that we are doing the best job that we can do with that. So yeah, I mean, if no one else carries it, no one else sponsors it, yeah, 100%. I'll take the audit bill straight to the floor and I'll argue up and down and fight whoever I need to.
This past session, we passed a $10 billion education trust fund budget and a $3.7 billion general fund budgets. Both are the highest on record that the state's ever had. Assuming we don't have a economic downturn, would you support removing that last 2% state taxes on groceries?
So this is where no, and here let me explain why. This is where a lot of, first off, reducing tax 100%, but a lot of people, I think, they're being misguided here. Yes, groceries are important. Don't get me wrong. Yes, they need to be cheap. They need to be affordable. People need to be able to buy groceries. I buy groceries all the time. We need to be able to buy groceries, right? But we're missing the forest for the trees. We're targeting a single, type of consumption tax or sales tax, when reality is we need to be focusing on reducing our income tax. Because if you remove income tax out, now this is a long process to do that, right? It's not like you just snap your fingers and boom, it's gone and you think everything's going to be okay. It's a process, right? So Mississippi's doing it right now. They're reducing their income tax individually to zero. Georgia's reducing their income tax right now. Soon they're going to have a lower income tax in the state of Alabama. Florida doesn't have income tax. Tennessee doesn't have income tax. You remove income tax over a period of time, you reduce that. That's going to give people more money in their pockets, which then they can go and buy groceries with. Right. And so instead of growing the budget, let's cut wasteful spending, cut waste in government, make government smaller and less intrusive. And then through that, you also start a process of reducing to the eventual goal of eliminating the income tax. Now, I understand in Alabama, that'd be a process and that'd take years to accomplish, if you got it passed, which would be difficult to get it passed, right? But I think ultimately that's where it needs to go, because ultimately you going and buying something at the grocery store is a voluntary action. You having your income taken from you from the state is involuntary. And so I'm not for involuntary taxes, like property tax and income tax. Both of those are involuntary taxes. So I would say focus more on doing that, reducing those taxes, rather than reducing a consumption or sales tax.
Micah, I know in your press release you was mentioning gambling. Are you against letting the people vote on gambling? And if so, why?
So people vote for their representatives, and their representatives have the vote on whether there should be gambling in the state. So I'm not saying that people don't have the right to vote. They do. When they vote for their candidate, they are voting for what they believe should be, they're the representatives of those people, right? So if they want gambling, then they should vote for somebody who wants gambling. If they don't want gambling, they should vote for someone who doesn't want gambling. That's their voice. The problem with gambling here in the state of Alabama, one, if you could have magically a clean lottery bill, right? Absolutely clean, 100% lottery, just a lottery bill, nothing else. You still have problems with that, but that would be an okay solution. The problem is in the way the state constitution works with games of chance, as they say. You remove that amendment, that opens it up to everything. So in order to actually get gambling passed, you'd basically have to do two constitutional amendments, one to remove it and one to create a new one. And then when you do that, you're risking the chance of not having a clean lottery. And if we know anything about the state of Alabama with politics, the moment you introduce any type of large money into the game, because we don't have caps on contributions, right, from organizations and companies. So you get all of these big high rolling gambling bosses out there. They're going to come in, they're going to buy off legislators, and they're going to get what they want passed. So just you open up that Pandora's box, it's never going back in. It's never going back in. And you're just going to increase corruption out to wazoo. So no, I'm not for that. But again, if someone, hey, they want all of that in the state of Alabama, they should vote for a candidate who also wants that. But the problem I see with it is everything that comes after it. So even if you don't talk about the primary, the secondary, the tertiary effects of this are disastrous. I mean, I served as a law enforcement officer, as you know, just a beat cop in Columbus, Georgia. Okay. Georgia has a lottery system. When I walked into a gas station, who do you think was playing the lottery in the gas station? Was it someone like me wearing a nice button down?
Probably
No,
the
the most
poorest state of
poorest.
Georgia.
It is absolutely the poorest, because they're almost in a desperation situation. They're trying to, get the money or for whatever reason. And that is it's not going to be different here in Alabama. It's going to be the same. And so the effects that you have down the road, and when you put someone in that situation, now they're losing money, because all likelihood they're probably not going to win, right? So they lose more money. That means they're in a more poverty state. And the lower you go in the poverty, the higher the crime rate goes. So they're more likely, in desperation, they're going to shoplift. They're going to commit robberies. They're going to break into places to steal, lawnmowers or whatever, and try to sell them. I mean, I saw it all the time as a police officer in Columbus. So I don't think it solves any of our problems, right? And I understand that some people see the lottery as like this end all be all. It's going to solve all of our problems, but in reality, it's not. It's not going to solve our problems. It would solve a short-term financial problem, but long-term, it would devastate the state. That's my opinion.
Isn't the issue with gambling in the legislature, not in the public, but with the legislature, is that you can never get a clean lottery bill to even begin the discussion, because the Porch Creek Indians and the other casino owners want to use that lottery bill as a vehicle for them to get a bunch of things they want. Their competitors, who have other casinos put out of business, to allow them to have table games and sports betting and a whole bunch of other new revenue streams.
Right. And that's how it has been, right? Pretty much every single bill that at least I've looked at in the last 4 or 5 years, that is exactly right. I mean, it is 100% favorite to the people who have already established casinos on federal land here in Alabama, which Porch Creek Indians and so forth. So yes, I mean, that is, and they dump money behind candidates that, are going to pass that. That's why I have $0 from them, so yes, that is very much the case. And unfortunately, it's unfortunate, because that means, people who they voted for are basically being bought and paid for, right, by these lobbyists to propose a certain thing. I mean, every single time in the last 10 years since they started pushing for the lottery and the gambling and so forth, what has been the answer from the people of Alabama? No. So what's pushing this? If it's a minority, what's pushing it? It's the people who already own them. It's the people who are dropping $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 behind a state candidate. That's where, follow the money, right? Follow the money. And so I think yes, you're correct. That is how it's been in the last, little while.
Yeah, since I've been covering the legislature, pretty much we're talking 15 years.
Yeah.
I remember last time you told me, it was a stat that stuck out in my mind. It was something like we had the 35th population or something and the 15th largest bureaucracy. I didn't butcher that.
Yeah. I can't remember the numbers, but
yeah,
yes, but by population, the state of Alabama has more government workers than I think about half the states or something like that. And of course, if you think about it from a conservative standpoint, how many red states versus how many blue states, right? So traditionally, unfortunately, Alabama usually ranks pretty high up on the, well, fortunately, ranks high up in the most conservatives voting bloc, but unfortunately, ranks really low on the conservative voting record by its legislators. And so that's pretty atypical. That's the typical machine, right, that we see in Montgomery, which a lot of people look at the Congress, federal Congress, say the House of Representatives and Senate, and they see that. Well, it's happening here in Montgomery too. It's just, it's not being covered as much, right? Fox News isn't covering Montgomery like Brand, so like you're not seeing it as much because that's not what the media is feeding you, but it's absolutely happening here too.
This past session, it didn't start out that way, but it ended up being that way. The big controversial issue the legislature took on was psychoactive cannabinoids derived from hemp. Basically marijuana, but not from a marijuana plant. The state, they were, divided between the faction that's for being wide open and letting you do whatever, whenever, to whoever, the more libertarian, view, and then the more hard line, let's ban it, shut it down, prohibitionist crew. And somehow the legislature found a middle ground where they're going to tax it and then turn it over to the ABC board to regulate it. If you'd been in the legislature, how would you have tackled that?
So I would not have been for it, first of all, just quite frank and honest. And the reason is, again, my personal experience I have had as a law enforcement officer, seeing the effects of THC, Delta 8, et cetera, et cetera. It sounds harmless until it's not harmless. You combine that with alcohol, you combine it with other drugs, it becomes almost like a intoxicant narcotic cocktail that becomes extremely deadly. Let me give you an example. There was a domestic dispute, and I'll keep everything kind of vague so it doesn't, specific instance, but there's a domestic dispute. And me and my partner ended up there, and this guy had a big butcher knife. He was coming at us with it. We ended up being able to tase him. Took 2 times to tase him, but thankfully we didn't have to shoot the guy, right? But he did come at us with a knife, but thankfully the taser worked, got him put down in handcuffs, so forth. Ended up, he had just tried to sexually assault his granddaughter. That was the domestic dispute that started it. But what ended up happening was the guy had marijuana and alcohol in the system. So you have 2 depressants in the system, which makes someone's cognitive ability basically non-existent, and it almost becomes animalistic in how people process things. And so adding into an already, marijuana is already illegal. What's in marijuana, right? THC, right? So like the problem with those type of cannabis and things of that nature is it is a depressant, and that depressant, depending on what it's laced with and everything else, right? Even if you had 100% pure marijuana, it's a depressant that's going to alter people's minds. And there's long-term effects and all kinds of stuff. And putting it in gas stations, I mean, that's just, it's ludicrous. So I would have been a hard no on it just across the board. Now, the whole medical marijuana thing, that's a whole different discussion, in my opinion. Actually having doctors prescribe, some type of medical marijuana of that kind, that's more of a medical thing, right? So doctors prescribe, narcotics all the time. So it would just be something else like that. But the whole smoking of marijuana and everything like that, there's not really, you don't have to smoke marijuana to get the medical effects. So there are other alternatives to that. So with what was being argued in the legislature this last session, I would have been a no vote for sure.
Okay, to follow up on that, you said that this man had marijuana and alcohol in his system. So you think that marijuana and alcohol can lead to somebody getting that violent?
Well, obviously he had violent tendencies beforehand, right? I'm not going to say that together in and of itself is not going to make someone do X, Y, and Z, but it does remove that cognitive, logical part of your frontal cortex, right? That marijuana affects that, and so does alcohol. You combine both of those together. I mean, that's just as they always say, don't drink alcohol with any medication. So you take two depressants that remove that frontal lobe from being a part of how your brain functions, and it's going to go back to your I can't remember the name of it, but basically the rear part of your brain, which actually does the more like breathing and all that kind of stuff, involuntary stuff. And so you're removing that logical portion of your brain. There's going to be effects, right? Whether that's you end up curled up on the couch crying because you're depressed or whatever, or you lose your ability to restrain yourself and you go and do something dumb. There's not really any good thing that comes from that to put together. Putting alcohol and marijuana together, there's not really anything good that comes of that.
And of course, alcohol by itself has a very long and very well documented history of removing inhibitions, things you would never consider doing in real life. There's a level of alcohol at which all of a sudden bad ideas suddenly start making sense.
I think we've all seen that. Yeah.
Or experienced it firsthand.
Yeah, I haven't, thankfully. I don't drink any alcohol, but yeah, I've definitely seen it for sure. And marijuana does the same thing. And there's plenty of research on that too. It's just a different type of, depressant. So, because in drugs and stuff, right? So you have depressants, and then you have, I can't remember, basically highs, right? Things that, excite you. So like depressants are your marijuanas, stuff like that. And then you have things like cocaine. Those are things that, push your endorphins high, give you like a rush. And so a lot of times you would see on the street, you'd see like a cocktail used. So you would have, a depressant, and then they would take a something to give them a high, whether it's cocaine or ecstasy or something.
Speedballing.
Right. So a lot of cocaine, a lot of crack cocaine stuff. You see that a lot. But yeah, so just every different drug has a different effect, right? And so depending on what you're taking, that can combine and do all kinds of crazy stuff. Definitely don't recommend anyone taking any drugs. They're not prescribed, but
Touching on a while ago about when I asked you about the budget and the bureaucracy, do you have any ideas of how we could trim some of that waste?
Yeah, so I think the first thing you have to do is really get a good picture of where you're at. I think, and maybe some people do, but I've looked at the information, the budget that's released every year, and the way the line items are done, it'll say just like, Henry County, $2 million. It doesn't tell you what that's for. Right. And so I think what needs to happen first is we almost need to have like an Alabama DOGE, right? An Alabama Department of Government Efficiency that literally goes line by line and starts auditing the entire state government. Because I guarantee you we will find tens, if not into the $100 million range of stuff that really should not be being funded by taxpayer dollars. And now I know for a fact there's some good stuff being funded. Right. There's a lady I know still serving veterans. They're like a veteran community where they live in these mini tiny homes and stuff for veterans that are transitioning. Really great thing that they're doing there. And they've received some grants from the state, and they're a line item. So like there's good stuff being funded, but we need to get down to the brass tacks and figure out what exactly is being funded, and does it really need to be funded? Right, which you saw DOGE do at the federal level, right? They exposed a bunch of stuff being funded that shouldn't be funded. So to think that Alabama would be immune to that would be, I think, not necessarily logical. So I think that's where we have to start first. We start there first, figure out exactly where everything's going, what's actually costing us money, and then we can start making cuts to that, programs that we shouldn't be funding, or things we shouldn't be funding, or reducing funding, or in some cases maybe increasing funding in some things that really should be funded, right? That's where we need to start first. Because go and say, oh, well, we'll just go in and slash everything 10%. Well, that's not necessarily a logical way of going about it. You really need to understand the picture before you start going in there and cutting things. In the military training wise, right, we always talk about the situation. And in our operation orders, situations first. So we really would have to understand the situation before we go in and start making cuts. But we need to understand the situation. We need I won't say third party, but, some type of organization or committee or something that's going to take, the next year and literally dig line by line and go to places and like investigate and figure out where's all this money actually going to. And that would be, I think, a combination of the legislature, the state auditor, the treasury. Like, I think it would be a combination of resources that could come together to create that type of Alabama Doge or whatever you want to call it, right? That would be able to go through and have to do that line by line audit. Because, I mean, when was the last time that was done? Has it ever been done?
I don't think.
I don't think it has since the states.
In 2012, when we were in the Great Recession, and then the Obama stimulus money ran out, the legislature really had to dig to find cuts wherever they could find cuts, in order to make the general fund budget work.
Right. Yeah, and that's probably the closest that we've come to it, right? They probably themselves went in and be like, okay, where can we cut things? But again, I don't know everyone who is in the legislature at that point, but are they really looking at their own pet projects to cut? Probably not. Right. So that's where I think you need almost a third party type thing to come in and say, hey, like, these are all the things that are being funded. They literally
went from a general fund budget of 2.2 billion. We were looking at 1.6 billion. Then they rated to get some money out of the Alabama Trust Fund to operate for 3 years. So they got that down to about a $1.75 billion.
Right. Which now are what? We're over 3 point something. 3.
Now we're at 3.7 billion.
3.7 billion. Yeah. Now, of course, inflation and everything else has greatly affected those numbers as well. But our tax revenue has also gone up every single year without fail. So I still think there's definitely cuts that could be made. And I think there needs to be some type of real in-depth process to go through all that and find what cuts can actually be made and where they can be made.
You mentioned the state auditor there for a minute. In 39, the legislature and the state auditor, who's a constitutional official, so the legislature just can't get mad and abolish the office. What they did in 39, in that spat, everyone's dead from then, but they took all the auditing power away from the auditor. Of course, now they just do a inventory of state property, which is there's only. Would you, as a legislator, be in favor of moving the auditor arm of the auditor, which is the examiner of public accounts, from under direct control of the legislature and giving it back to the elected auditor, whoever that might be?
I would be, and let me explain why. So in our forms of government, right, we have checks and balances. And when they took that away, it happened in 39. A lot of stuff was happening in 39 in Alabama, by the way. When they took that away, you removed part of that check and balance system. So you took the executive, constitutional law office of the auditor, and you took away basically its teeth, its ability to actually audit the financial side of the state. Now, of course, they still audit property. Like you said, they still do inventory of all the property, which I think is still a valuable thing. But I do think having them remove that from them has removed some of the checks and balances. And so putting that back, I definitely think the discussion needs to be had. I'm definitely against abolishing the state auditor's office, which I know has been brought up several times in the last several years. So I think discussion needs to be have some, an honest discussion of looking at how that would actually work, of getting that transition back over. But I definitely think it would be a better system for a check and balance to make sure, things weren't being done that shouldn't be being done.
Being a law enforcement or former law enforcement officer, the bill that was passed this year, giving them an extra layer of protection, do you think that was justified, or that's going a little too far?
Too far. And I know that's crazy as someone who used to be law enforcement, right? Qualified immunity. The problem you have, and this has been, in the academy, they talk to us about qualified immunity, and it only protects you when you're doing, your job as a law enforcement officer in the duties at that department and so forth. The problem is it's almost given them a carte blanche blanket to protect them. For example, let's say I pulled you over, I violated one of your constitutional rights, whatever constitutional right you want to choose, right? I violate your constitutional rights. If that is the first instance of, that happening, however I violated your constitutional rights, you take me to court for it. If that's the first instance, then I get off scotch-free, even though I did violate your rights. Because it was the first instance, I get off scotch-free. Qualified immunity removes the accountability to the people. And so there already is qualified immunity, right? The state of Alabama just made it even harder to sue law enforcement. Now, I know a lot of law enforcement officers are going to get upset with me saying that. I understand. Trust me. They used to be there, right? You don't want to spend all day in court. You don't want to be taken to court all the time for ridiculous things you actually, based on, precedent and so forth, you're totally fine with doing, right? 100% understand. However, that's why it's important to elect good judges, because a judge can dismiss a ridiculous case. If I pull somebody over, they've got, cocaine sitting in their lap and they're smoking it, I can pull them out of the car and I can arrest them, right? Well, if they say, well, they violated my constitutional rights because they, pulled me out of the car or whatever. Well, there's plenty of precedent to show that that's ridiculous, and that, law enforcement do have the ability to pull you. If they pull you over, they have probable cause, therefore they can pull you out of the car. Like there's cases to show that. So a judge is going to go, this is a ridiculous lawsuit, and toss it out. Right. So that's the whole point of making sure we elect good judges, so that justice system operates how it should be. But having a front end qualified immunity blanket like they did, I don't think was the best way of going about it, especially in the environment that we're in today, where people don't trust law enforcement already. Now you're giving them more immunity. That's not going to help the situation.
During this past session, the legislature funded for the first time the Choose Act, which allows some of the money that, is set aside for every child to actually follow the child if the parent so chooses to send their child to a private school,
right,
or even another public school outside of their district, or a charter school or something like that.
right.
Do you favor school choice?
I do. I think it brings about better competition in a market that has been for a very long time lacked competition. So now schools, instead of just being like, oh, we're going to get funded pretty much no matter what we do, they're going to have to make sure they're providing a good enough product that parents are going to be, satisfied with sending their kids to that school. I mean, here locally, Opelika city schools have a really good high school. Auburn has a really good high school. Valley has a decent high school, so there's definitely public schools that are doing it right, but there's also some public schools that aren't doing it right. They're hiding things from parents. The administration's hiding things from parents. They're not telling parents stuff that's going on at their schools, stuff like that. a lot of bullying or whatever else is going on, and they're not doing anything about it. Those schools need change. And up until the Choose Act, you didn't even have an option, right? If you couldn't afford out of your own, pocketbook to send your kid to private school, you're just the middle of the road, blue collar worker, you can't afford to send your kid to public, private school or to a different public school that wasn't legal. So yeah, I think it's a good option. I'm not for completely defunding public schools. I think they need to be funded for sure, because people need to have education. But I think we need to really think about, if a school loses 20% of its students, maybe that county school board needs to look at that school and go, maybe something's wrong and they need to fix it. Instead of going, oh, well, it's because of these, parents don't understand or whatever. So I think it was a good option. I think it does give parents more choice. And ultimately, it's the parents' responsibility to make sure that their kids are educated properly. And I think that overall, it was a good way to go.
Now, before we started recording, you mentioned we was talking about this upcoming race. So, is it possible we're going to see a special election and then another election for the same seat within the next 10 months?
Yes. So for those who aren't aware, Debbie Wood, who previously held District 38, she announced her resignation beginning of last month, and it'll take effect at the end of this month. So July 31st, it will take effect. And so we're anticipating that August timeframe, somewhere on there, the governor will call for a special election. So likely late October or early November. It could be, either way, and that'll be for the primary election, or the primary, for the party primary, and then the actual election probably taking place, the general for it taking place sometime in January timeframe. But again, those are all just, kind of guesses. But yes, we were anticipating there will be a special election that will be called, and then whoever wins that election will have to turn right back around and qualify again for the midterms, which are coming up next year.
The legislature passed a bill, allowing, our major cities to expand use of cameras, in identifying vehicles that are, involved in like drag racing and street racing. Are you in favor of, increasing our ability to use electronic surveillance and that sort of thing to aid law enforcement?
So that's kind of a tricky question. If you're in a public space, right? So if you're on a street, walking down the street, then your expectation of privacy by law is basically nil, right? Because you're in public. So technically, I could set up a bunch of cameras, or if I own businesses, I could set a bunch of cameras and be recording the street 100% legally. So whether you're a private citizen or you're a public entity, legally wise, anything in public view is okay. The problem you get is when you start getting into enforcement actions using cameras in automatic systems. So if you're just using a street camera, right, that sits there at an intersection and you see someone do a hit and run, right? Very useful for law enforcement. They can see the vehicle, maybe get the tag or whatever, and they can track down the perpetrator and make sure that they, get charged with whatever crimes appropriate to whatever they did, right? Can be very useful. The problem you get into is when you start doing enforcement actions. So red light cameras, speed cameras, things of that nature. I'm not for those. Again, kind of crazy law enforcement, right? But I'm not for those. And that because that gets down into kind of a nitty gritty law issue, a probable cause of, if you see a vehicle, how do you know the driver of the vehicle is the owner of the vehicle and you're putting a ticket in the owner's name, but it could be a different driver. And so that gets into a really, really mushy area of, do you actually have probable cause to issue a citation to that vehicle? And that's why places like Phoenix City, Alabama, and other cities are doing it as a county level or city level ordinance, and it's a civil thing. It's not a criminal thing. Because if they did it as a criminal offense, then it actually would end up being, in my opinion, being tossed out because of lack of probable cause that you could have. Because what we were taught in the academy as law enforcement is if you pulled somebody over, you can't just pull over a vehicle because the owner of the vehicle had a warrant. You didn't have probable cause to pull that vehicle over. You could pull the vehicle over if they violated a traffic, law, if they were speeding or they didn't stop at a stop sign or something like that, then you could pull them over. But you couldn't pull them over just because the owner of the vehicle, the registered owner of the vehicle, had a warrant. You couldn't pull them over because you don't know if that's the person actually driving the vehicle. Unless you can pull up next to them, look over, see that it's the owner, and see that that's the guy who has a warrant. I've got a picture of him right here. Then you could pull over the vehicle because you're trying to stop the person who has the warrant, right? So I'm not for increasing electronic surveillance on private citizens. That gets into the unwarranted searches and seizures. But people do honestly understand that a city can put up a camera at an intersection and it be legal because you're in public view. Now, they can't do that in your private home. They can't demand access to your surveillance footage that you may have inside of your place of business or your home. They can't do that because that is, the expectation of privacy is there.
There was legislation that was brought last year, didn't go anywhere, that would allow Pell City to link their surveillance systems with residents' doorbell cams, where you'll all be one network, all monitored by the police.
Yeah, the all-seeing eye.
Where we're watching everything at all times.
Right. Yeah. So I would not be for that. Because again, I know the idea was like, oh, it would be only voluntary only, right? You would have to volunteer into the system. But here's the thing. This is coming from an IT background, right? If you open up a window from the city government to whichever type of whether it's Ring, Simply Safe, whoever owns the doorbell cams or the security cameras, right? You open up that door, they're going to be able to go in and access any of them. Anyone with any type of, minimal hacking ability would be able to go in and access anybody's. You wouldn't need, their permission. So it's better to keep that door closed. Again, let's not open Pandora's box there. Let's keep it closed. If the city needs help, then the city can ask for help. If there's, they'll say there's a drive-by shooting on a road. Part of what we do as law enforcement is we canvass. We go door to door. You ask people, hey, did you see anything? Do you have any cameras that we could use? Like, that's part of the investigation. So you really don't need that. You're going to be able to do that anyway.
Talking about this surveillance, do you kind of go back in time here? Do you think the Patriot Act was wrong? Because, that just basically gave them the right to open surveillance on anybody.
Yeah. Of course, that's a federal law, right? So not necessarily state level, but my personal opinion is yes, it was wrong. Now, was it done out of the intention of trying to stop another terrorist attack? Yes. However, what it did was it created a secondary justice system where you have the ability for them to, surveil on a private citizen without them being able to confront their accuser. So you have entire, I can't remember what they call it, but the court system that basically where they can, whether it's FBI or DEA or whatever, goes to this court system and says, hey, we believe this person is doing X, Y, and
then
Z.
it goes to the FISA court.
Right, FISA court. Thank you. I was trying to remember of it, and say, hey, we want to access all of their phone records. We want to be able to access, everything that they do on a daily basis, 24/7. And the judge then signs off on it. And you as a private citizen have no idea. And you could be not doing anything wrong. And so you have no, and that's happening in a court. Like, so you don't even know what's happening. So you don't even know that you can't confront your accuser. So I think that whole system is just ripe for abuse. by a government.
Because you look at like on Google Maps or Google Earth or whatever, I mean, they can take a camera and look right up to your front door and right in your backyard, and that's there. So if we can do that as private citizens, I mean, what kind of surveillance does the government have?
Well, I think so. Again, that's the public expectation of privacy, right? So like technically I can stand on the street and look at your house all day. I think it'd be weird, and I might call the police eventually. But like, legally you can do that. Google Earth can do that. What they're talking about with the FISA courts is specifically of capturing your data on your personal cell phone or your computer, accessing your microphone and your camera remotely. They can do that. Like and I can't get into specifics because I have had briefings on certain stuff, but like they can see whether your phone turned like this or not. Okay, they can see that. So when you're talking about that level of information they're pulling, I think it definitely violates unlawful searches and seizures. That's just, again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I think the founders should be rolling over in their graves.
Yesterday, the president signed the big, beautiful bill, and Democrats made a number of concerns with that bill in that it makes cuts to Medicaid and other federal programs over time.
Mm-hmm.
As a potential state legislator, since the state gets, we have $10 billion in the education trust fund, 3.7 billion in the general fund. We have another
and the rest is
3
all
billion
set aside.
that's off the books, and things like gas taxes or oil and gas money or agency fees that doesn't show up in the budgets. But then there's like 10 to 12 billion in federal matching dollars. A lot of it's
I think it's
Medicaid.
I think it's 12.7.
Yeah. Around 12, 13 billion dollars.
Yeah.
Are you concerned that those cuts could adversely affect the state because, we're spending that money even if it's not inside of our budgets?
Right. No, of course it could affect the state. If there's going to be cuts made, then the state's going to have to look at that as well as what cuts can we make. And that's going to trickle down, so to speak. So yeah, of course you got to be concerned with that. When you lose federal dollars, how are you going to make up for that? And I think, of course, all the time we talk about reform, reforming this, reforming that. And yeah, of course we can do that. But ultimately there needs to be, it's a complex issue of trying to get people off of welfare type systems, SNAP, EBT, Medicaid, and Medicare. Like it's a complex system to try to get people off of that, because we want people to be productive members of society, right? We want people to be, successful. We want people to be, comfortable and, have a good retirement and everything like that, right? I think no one's like, oh, I wish 50% of the people just couldn't retire. No, I think in general, people want that. And so you have to balance that desire with whether the government can actually facilitate it. And yes, with the patches of the big, beautiful bill, of course, there's going to be concern with that coming, not getting as much federal dollars. And so there might have to be cuts made at the state level that could impact people just to keep us from going into debt. It's a concern. I don't know how much actually is going to come to fruition. The cuts made are over, I think it's the course of the next 10 years. So it's a gradual reduction. And of course we know, and it could all change in 3 years or 2 years when the next group of, legislators get up to Congress. So, I wouldn't be too concerned about it, but it is something that we, of course the legislator would have to look at and debate about.
You seem to be like really knowledgeable about the Constitution. I mean, do you think that people, we'll tell you this story, like, I guess people don't know their rights or whatever. A couple of years ago, I got stopped, and after a few minutes, the officer was like, well, okay, I need to ask if you have anything on you. I was like, no. And he said, well, you wouldn't mind if I searched you? And I said, no. He goes, no, you don't mind, or no, I can't. I said, no, you can't. You don't have probable cause. And the officer said, okay, have a nice evening. And my friend later, he said, well, why didn't you just let him search you? I said, because I'm not giving him that right.
Yeah, I think again, we talked about it with the education, right? I think in general, most people don't know what their rights actually are. Now, there are people who do. Again, some schools are doing a very good job at it. And it's individuals at those schools or whatever. But I think in general, there is a lack of knowledge. And I don't think it's, some people think it's a nefarious thing where like they intentionally have been, making people ignorant. And maybe there's some people out there that's been their goal. I think it's just overall, I mean, who wants to really study something that's 240 years old? I mean, it's just in reality, right? I mean, no, I want to go play my Fortnite. I want to go play, whatever. I want to go watch, The Bachelorette or whatever. Like, there's the desire of most people is not to study history. It's not to study old documents and to get into constitutional, debates with people. That's not what most people are thinking about on what they're going to do on a Saturday night. Now, I'm weird because I enjoy that kind of stuff. And my wife talks, but we basically, we have to kind of like, okay, I won't get into a constitutional debate. She's like, please don't bring that. Yeah, like, that's, again, everyone's different, right? But I do think there needs to be a basic understanding of people's rights, actually understanding what the First Amendment is, what the Second is, what the Fourth and the Fifth are, which are very important. The Sixth is, having, not overly ridiculous bonds. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in the amendments of the Constitution, especially the first 10, but of course, all the others that are important, that can change, like you said, the interaction with that law enforcement officer. He wasn't trying to be evil and trying to like unlawfully search you. He was asking permission, which any law enforcement officer can do. And when you said no, he was like, okay, whatever, have a good day. Which you have the right to do. The people say, well, why would you do that? You don't have any, if you don't have anything to hide, why would you? Well, no, that's not the point. The point is to make sure government doesn't rule us. It was always intended to be a government by the people and for the people. We, the people of these United States of America, right? That's the preamble. So like the whole intention was be of the people, not a government forcing things on the people. And so it may seem silly, but exercise your rights in those situations, and be like, no, I don't give you consent, nothing against you, man. But like, I don't want you searching my pockets. Now legally, can they pat you down for weapons? Yes. There's court cases on that. They can pat you down, but they can't stick their hand in your pocket. Like there's very particular things that law enforcement have to know. Like they can pat around your waistband, they can pat up and down you, but they can't actually stick their hand in your pockets, try to pull anything. And if they feel something in your pocket, that doesn't give them the right to stick their hand in there. Only if they absolutely know what they feel is like a weapon. Right. I mean, a gun's pretty specific, right? It's like an L shape. There's very few things that are like an L shape. But anyway, we're getting off on constitutional law here.
Micah, we've had you for an hour. Thank you so much for being on. That's all I have, unless Christopher, you'd like to have something.
No, we've kept him on for an hour. I'll get this uploaded quick, and good luck, Micah.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Chris. And thank you, Brandon. I appreciate it.
Thanks.